Hello. This is the first edition of Discuss the Tape podcast. It was filmed or recorded on the 15th of November 2024. We were lucky to be joined by Steve Allen, who is a veteran of Silicon Valley, and we discussed a whole range of topics. We looked into the Silicon Valley Bank collapse last year. We looked into what Trump might mean for technology and technology investment going forward. We did a little deep dive into AI, and we broke down the tech ecosystem in Australia. So, hope you enjoy it. It's the first one, and please give me feedback. Thank you. So, we're recording. Thank you, Steve, for turning up. Let's dive right into it. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your career history, where you were born, all the good stuff?
So I had the good fortune of being born actually in Silicon Valley, just outside of San Jose, a town called Los Gatos that is better known now as Netflix headquarters. But
Wow.
back in the day, it was orange and apple orchards, so it's evolved quite a bit over 5 decades. But from there, ended up doing a little stint out in New York for J.P. Morgan and a little stint for AT&T back in the first internet infrastructure timeframes, and then ended up moving back to the roots in Silicon Valley, and went and worked for Silicon Valley Bank, which is really where I got most of my exposure to the innovation ecosystem.
So
Was
when
there
did you, Steve, when did you decide you went east instead of staying in Silicon Valley? What did your parents think you were crazy, or was that a more respectable job?
It was actually probably that I thought my parents were crazy. So when you grow up where your mom is a vice principal of a Catholic school, you can imagine what that household is like. So
Yeah.
myself and my two sisters went east as fast as we could when we turned 18. So
Okay.
I think we all ended up returning home to the Bay Area, but at the same time, I think we needed to spread some wings at that point in time and get away, despite the fact that we were moving to colder climates that weren't as hospitable and not necessarily as exciting.
Yeah. So, and then how did you get into Silicon Valley Bank? Obviously, most people have heard of it now, but back then it was kind of a new thing, right?
Well, it had been around, I mean, since really the 1980s, but it was a regional bank. It was a small bank. It was banking the innovation ecosystem, which was still relatively small, but growing. I had some exposure to it just in the time in Silicon Valley. My dad had kind of worked in the old school hardware days in the 70s and 80s, and so that really provided an opportunity for me to see and understand a little bit about that ecosystem. I'd always had an affinity for the venture capital space and kind of how those models had worked, and really understanding what's going on from there. So when I saw this opportunity, I've always been a bit of a data dork. Done a lot of that at J.P. Morgan before I went to grad school at Duke University, and then leaving Duke, there was this opportunity. I got recruited to come join SVB specifically to help set up their data analytics infrastructure, and so that's really how I moved over there, and then helped them build that out, and then build out, kind of serving a little bit of as a you know, I guess, entrepreneur in residence, helping them to build out a few different things along valuations and research departments and cap table management software and
Okay.
derivatives portfolios. So it expanded quite a bit while we were there, but it was a fun, exciting time. And frankly, when I joined, I'll admit I didn't realize how beneficial it was going to be when I joined. It sounded like a fun thing to do. But then when you got into that data and you actually recognized that they had, 80+% market share of the venture backed ecosystem, and you start to realize how ripe that data was, it really provided some kind of incredible insights into the underlying pulse of what's happening in the valley and why and how it's doing that.
And that's the
Um,
interesting thing. I mean, most people overseas, at least, probably only know Silicon Valley Bank when it collapsed. You know, they became aware of it, but it was an incredibly successful bank, and it sort of was kind of like the old community banks of the past, and ended up being maybe the 16th biggest bank in the US
yeah,
or up there, right? So, okay, I mean, was it a great place to work? Were they were kicking goals, they were getting everything right until obviously calamity hit, right? Did it come as a
yeah. I mean,
surprise?
well, yeah. I mean, I think it's fair enough to say it was a surprise. I guess for kind of a quick rehash of SVB's business model, um,
Yep.
it was it was pure brilliance, right? The model itself. Essentially, what they understood is that in the startups by definition are high risk, right? And so you implicitly understand that to mean that you had higher interest rates. But the reality of Silicon Valley Bank and its magic was the fact that it had lower write-offs than people providing automobile loans, right? But they could charge 8 and 10, 12% coupons when rates were zero, right? So I
Yeah.
mean, if you think about it, they were just minting money at sub 1%. Everyone was worried that ultimately, the downfall of an SVB would be overexposure to the venture ecosystem, right? Because we do know that, you know, 60+% of companies, go to zero for their investors, and there's another portion that maybe gets them some portion of their money back. But Silicon Valley Bank understood that what they were doing was not underwriting the lifetime risk of that company. They're underwriting the next financing risk. And so for them, it was just as much understanding the investors as it was understanding the companies themselves. And that really is, I think, that magic that they brought together. The other thing about it that I found incredible is the people there. This is actually ironic. I think part of it probably helped lead to the downfall. The people that there were amazing. Blew me away. Like I was at J.P. Morgan, and there was great, super intelligent people there, but when you hit SVB, it was a different caliber of character in regards to how much they actually genuinely cared about their clients and cared about the ecosystem, and really were in it for the growing of the rising tide lifts all boats mentality. And I think there was just as much passion from essentially what was a service provider as there was from the entrepreneurs and the investors themselves into these companies. And that was what was incredible about it. Because of that, they were very, very, very strict on their hiring practices. So
Yeah.
it was not a put a butt in the seat because it's been empty for 8 weeks and you just got to get it filled. I mean, I think when I joined, they were without a chief marketing officer for about 2 years. I mean, can you imagine a bank going without a
Yeah.
chief marketing officer for two? But they just need to wait for the right person, right? And when she came along, she's been there for 15 years, right? So it's like that's the kind of mentality that they've had, and a lot of that long tenured folks. I think that's part of what probably got them to this issue is the insanity of 2021, which I mean you want to talk about the bubble of 2000 2001 2020 2021, put that to shame. The reality is that they grew deposits by 3x in 18 months, and
Yeah.
they thought they were doing the right thing, which was putting them in liquid securities being US treasuries. It's just they didn't build the right laddering portfolio of it. And so here everyone's worried about the exposure to the billions of dollars they were lending out to the venture ecosystem, and it was the 140 billion dollars they stuck in US treasuries that ultimately brought the bank down, just because of the liquidity crunch that happened. And they would have been fine if there wasn't Twitter. They would have been fine, because essentially Twitter caused a run on the bank, and ultimately it's just bad timing. And I'm sure there's going to be a book or a movie about it at some point when you start to understand what happened behind the scenes. Of it took 100 different things going wrong for it to end up where it did, and if one of those had gone the other way, in that series of 2 days. You'd still have the bank, probably half the market cap, but you'd still have the bank, and it would still be the dominant player in the valley instead of now where it's
Yeah.
fragmented up.
So, somewhat controversial point, but how much could you blame Peter Thiel? Because the Founders Fund pulled the money out, right? And
Yeah, I mean,
y-
I think the reality out of it is, um, this is, I think, probably where some older school folks, right, will tend to think about relationships mattering, and I think for Silicon Valley Bank, relationships have always mattered. It's been the
yeah,
key component of all of it. In fact, the rock stars in the bank were the relationship managers, right? Not the
right,
underwriters, not the credit committee. It was the
yeah,
RMs. Um, and then I think what we realized at that moment in time is that, and to be clear, I had left the bank in 2017, so I wasn't actually there to witness this inside out. But I obviously have a lot of really close friends that were, and so
yeah,
kind of gotten all these stories. In fact, I happened to be in San Francisco that night, so having dinner with some of them. So it shows you how unexpected it was
sure.
in regard to that Wednesday. We're all out to dinner having fun, and Thursday you end up with a run on the bank. Um,
It's crazy.
but if you think about it, what you learned there was that um, just the how fear can overtake in so many instances. And I think what did happen is, for some of these VCs, and it wasn't just Peter Thiel, right? It was kind of a widespread VCs looking at it saying, "Man, I've put hundreds of millions of dollars into these companies. I can't have a scenario where these companies are not able to access that cash. I'm going to have them go pull their money out now so I don't have to worry about this later."
Yeah,
And that really was a fundamental misunderstanding that there was enough cash in the bank. They're just locked up in securities that if they sold, they'd have to sell at a discount and take a loss. And so ultimately they were trying to just figure that out. There wasn't a single depositor dollar lost in the whole process.
is
So
that
it
because of
kind
the
of
FDIC to securing it, or yeah,
well, you could say 'cause the FDIC, but the reality is FDIC only provides insurance up to two hundred
two
fifty
fifty,
thousand
yeah,
dollars. You can imagine there's bank balances of 200, 300, 400 million dollars for some of these
yeah,
companies. So the reality is you're talking about $220 billion, 140-ish of which was in U.S. Treasuries. So it's just a matter of how you'd securitize the cash out of those treasuries, which I guess what gets to the timing thing. If SVB had made it to the weekend, right, it got taken over on Friday morning before the
yeah,
market opened. If it made it to the weekend, Janet Yellen stepped in and said, "We will basically give you back the cash on your treasuries at a 3% interest rate so you can stabilize." Well, that worked for most of the other banks. First Republic actually ended up succumbing to the similar run. For them, wasn't their fault on it. It was SVB's that helped trigger them, and they ended
yeah,
up in J.P. Morgan's hands. But the reality is, if you'd just gotten to that point and SVB had been able to send all the treasuries back to Janet, and then Janet send the cash across, then there would have been no more run on the bank, and SVB would probably gotten most of that money back that got transferred, ironically, to the J.P. Morgans of the world,
sure, sure.
because it would have calmed the run, and people would have actually understood there's money there. But Twitter took over, and on Twitter it said, you know,
That's
it's
right.
banks
That's
out of
right.
money. You're done. And it's like, no, no, no. This wasn't 2008. This wasn't subprime collapse. In fact, that's the beauty of SVB. They didn't even get hit in 2008 because they had zero exposure, because that has nothing to do with our business.
Yeah,
And so
yeah,
kind of look at it. They always been really good at managing their venture debt risk. This was literally a treasury issue that, if they had made it 8 more hours, would have been resolved over the weekend. They would have opened Monday, and they would have had full liquidity for everybody. If they wanted to withdraw it, great, they could do so. But most likely, people would have put the deposits back in, and we would be discussing the near collapse of SVB, but not the
that's right. That's right. I
collapse.
often, Steve, I've often thought that it was so disastrous and it could have been avoided in many ways. And the Silicon Valley has many companies with tons and tons of capital, cash on their balance sheet, and there were ways to do something with that cash if you could have been organized enough, quick enough. But obviously, when someone screams fire in the theater, everyone panics. And so it was your classic bank run, right? At the end of the day. And it was disastrous because I think ultimately Credit Suisse, felt the effect of it as well. It's hurt. Credit Suisse went down. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it had collateral damage just because, as you said, the fear spread and people started to look, oh, well, who else has, more longer duration securities, and what does that
Correct.
trigger? No, it was I mean, panic by definition is illogical, right? And
That's
I
right.
like the way you said it. If it's fire in a crowded theater, you get outside, you realize there's actually no fire, and then you go back in
Yeah.
and watch the rest of the show. In
Yeah.
this particular case, the problem is once people left the building, the ticket said, no readmittance, and
Yeah.
and here it's really unfortunate. I mean, obviously, there was, $40 billion of market cap that got wiped out. There was a lot of fear and trepidation.
So moving on to something a bit more current, other than Silicon Valley Bank, Trump, President Trump. Everyone's talking about him. Um, Obviously, there are big changes coming with deregulation, perhaps, but he has also become quite a favorite of Silicon Valley. Can you just dig into that a little bit? Why that's happened and what that might mean, if that's okay, Steve?
Yeah, no, obviously a hot button issue. Do my best around it, but I think simply put, uh, VCs are economically rational actors, and I think if they look and put together, what they've experienced during the Biden Harris administration. I mean, there was essentially conversations about much higher taxes on these billionaires. There was unrealized capital gains taxes. There was additional spending that was going to put federal deficit issues and what that was going to trigger from interest payments and instability from a macroeconomic perspective. You look at the regulatory frameworks that have existed. This is some of the lowest level of M&A we've ever seen. And so, yes, there was a little bit of a heyday there in 2021 and a rush for exits out the door where a good, 30% of the companies rush to an exit. The reality is the normal amount is somewhere in the low teens, call it, 14, 15% of companies exit per year. And the reality of that is you had it drop down to 2-3% from the last 3 years of the Biden-Harris administration. And so when you put all that together, it really was seen as kind of, almost an anti-Silicon Valley type of stance from DC during that time period. And so inherently they had a choice between a continuation, possible acceleration of that with another 4 years with Harris, which could turn into 8 years, or potentially going down the avenue with Trump. I think everyone would agree is a little more transactional versus principled of a politician, and who really would look at it and try to understand. Okay, we have a debt problem. We've got choices of cutting our way out. We've got choices of inflating our way out. We've choices of growing our way out. I choose cutting and growing, and I think I can do that. I mean, obviously, you got
Yeah.
Doge
Yeah.
and what's going on there, but then you've also got an idea of deregulation where you'll see him, move very quickly to pull Lena Khan out and Gary Gensler out and
That's
really,
interesting. That is definitely interesting. And before Doge and Lena Khan, it's just, it's clear that Silicon Valley have acted with their wallet, really. I mean, Trump is presumably going to be more favorable for the Valley in many ways. But just touching upon the politics of Silicon Valley, it does seem to be, at times performative. Like one side they're very liberal and cool, and they tick all the woke boxes, and then on the other, they all of a sudden are worried about, the bottom line and things like, growth industries like defense. From an outsider's point of view, it gets confusing. They're libertarian on one side, the Peter Thiels of the world, etc. But then they're quite dependent on the government for subsidies, for contracts, if it's Palantir or something. Don't you find it interesting? What was it like to live amongst that? Does it mess with your mind? I mean, what's it like to live in Silicon Valley?
Yeah, I mean, I think like any melting pot, right? There's a variety of different people and stances. I think just generally speaking, California and the West Coast have been more liberal rather than conservative
Yeah.
in general. But if I had to sum up the valley itself, and this is a gross simplification, but they are fiscally conservative and they are, socially progressive. So they do believe in free speech. They do believe, and really, this is part of what's interesting about, Trump. Trump isn't traditional Republican, right? He's populist. So there's certain stances he actually takes that used to be the Democrats' stances, right? So
Yeah.
the irony of it is it's all a little bit of a mixed bag. This isn't the traditional, red Republican, blue Democrat, and here's where it goes. So I think what that's caused in this evolution is, an understanding that you've got to ultimately start picking between, are you focused on your social ideals? And so maybe like a Reid Hoffman, who really is looking at and saying, hey, I'm actually more focused on my principles from a social perspective. And then you have others, whether it's Peter Thiel or David Sachs, that maybe are looking at it from an economic perspective. The thing being, though, I think even when you get to Peter and David and whatnot, they actually are really genuinely concerned about the long-term viability of the country. And so you look at it, everyone's actually concerned about the viability and the status is kind of number one in the world, and what's happened over since World War II in the United States. How do they keep that as a go forward? It's just there's differences in opinions and approach to it, where you look at it and say, well, in one hand, you've got Trump. How could you elect, someone who caused the January 6th insurrection, contributed to the January 6th insurrection, right? Like that is at the core roots of fundamental democracy in the United States, is the peaceful transition of power. And here was the first time ever, right? And you kind of look and say, wow, like even coming down to saying, I don't believe I lost, right? Even though mathematically it's impossible given the amount of votes that he did lose for that to happen. And there's even, we don't need to
Steve,
go
I've got to be careful because I think half my friend base are very big supporters of Trump. So I'm just going to get lots of WhatsApp messages. So I'm just trying to avoid getting into even more trouble than usual.
Yeah, no, you can cut what you need to, but I guess
no, that's going to be included.
Yeah, the general idea is just that they're all actually looking at the future, and no politician is solving exactly what they need. And so ultimately, as is a lot of cases, you're picking the lesser of two evils. And so that's what they're doing, is they're looking at and saying, well, what Trump is able to put forward gives a better long-term leadership potential and economic potential to the United States. Yes, they may not agree with his messaging. Yes, they may not agree with how he delivers what he says. Yes, they may not agree with some of his history, but ultimately they're willing to put that aside because they look at the other side and they say, well, this could actually be the downfall of the U.S. if in fact spending continues at this ramped up pace in the way that it has in an unchecked perspective.
Sure.
And so I think that's really what they're weighing there, and they're just trying to be super rational about it.
So Reid Hoffman is an interesting guy, right? So for the listeners who don't know, he co-founded or founded LinkedIn, and is a very big influence in Silicon Valley. Generally, traditionally was a Democrat, but bringing it back to Lina Khan of the FTC, he was actually a big opponent of Lina Khan, right? He didn't like her too much. Presumably that's because he's also on the board of Microsoft. Is that correct? Yeah.
Yes,
So,
yeah, he was acquired and is on the board.
so for the listeners who don't know, Lina Khan, FTC chairperson, took on Microsoft when it was trying to acquire Activision. That proved to be not successful. But she's an interesting character because on some level, she's a bit like Gary Gensler. You need to have some compliance. You need to have some checks and balances. But she's now universally hated, right? So, and it's across both aisles. It's, and you're just wondering, is it entirely fair? Like, shouldn't
Yeah, no,
she be able to challenge these people, right?
yeah, no, I agree with you in regards to the is it fair? I think the reality that you have here is if you kind of go back and look during let's call it the 2022 window there where Adobe's acquisition of Figma got
Yeah,
shot down, and it got shot down for a reason that had not historically been done by the FTC, discussing kind of labor monopolies. And it's,
yeah,
essentially you're sitting there going, wait a minute, like there's a difference between like monopolies in the traditional sense of what monopolies are, and then it felt like this was kind of an application of the law rather than the intent. And
yeah.
so that's why I think that you ended up saying, well, there's a line, and did Lena cross it? And then unfortunately, I think you can say sometimes Silicon Valley can be unforgiving in these regards once you've crossed that line, especially if the intent is to now move the line. And so I think in some cases you'll actually find, ironically, that Silicon Valley people are supportive of Lena. In fact, the new vice president to be JD Vance is supportive of Lena in regards to attacking monopolies. So looking at it from what protects the consumer. And so is the consumer getting the best thing when you have all this power, for example, in a Google, right? And that's where obviously they're starting to look at Google and considering it should it be broken up. And so ironically, a lot of Silicon Valley actually is supporting the idea of breaking up Google because it allows them to compete more. Right? It allows
Yeah.
them to be able to take on the big behemoth that's out there. Ironically, these are all the same people who made a bunch of money off of Google over the 20-year time frame. So you see that, but what they really need is they need these smaller acquisitions. So like the Figma by an Adobe, so they can get the capital out of these companies to recycle them back to their limited partners to then fund their next funds, to then fund the next startups. And that
Yeah.
part of the machine has come to a grinding halt over the
That's
last
right.
3
That's right.
years. And they're
Yeah.
all picking Lena as the reason why. Now, is that fair or unfair? Reserve that judgment. Was she a contributing factor, and did that cause some of these corp dev departments to slow M&A activity because you go do all this work to then have it get shut down at the very end? Well, they wanted some more certainty and consistency, and they felt like they
Sure.
weren't getting it. And so they said, forget that. Let's go invest money in NVIDIA chips, and let's go build out, the next
Let's
wave
go
of
buy back
AI.
some stock.
Let's buy back
Yeah.
stock. Let's do that. Like
Yeah.
they're going to use their cash some way. It just that's where I think the frustration has been, because now you've got a backlog of, call it $2.5 trillion of startup
Well,
companies about these
it,
exits.
Steve, it's really interesting though when you look at the history of monopoly antitrust law and how it's sort of morphed into, the important thing is just prices for consumers as opposed to an ecosystem, suppliers, and how everything works, staff, labor. So we've kind of moved it. The whole definition of the problem has moved over the last 20 to 30 years, I think. And I always felt that she was just, you know, re-bookmarking it back to maybe pre-Reagan sort of time, where you sort of discuss some of these other areas of monopoly. I might be wrong, but I didn't think she was. I mean, at the end of the day, you don't want to fight City Hall. You don't want to have, enemies in powerful places, right? So, she's gone, right? And in a similar way, I look at Gary Gensler, and if you did Series 7, right, when you were at JP Morgan, remember that exam, that regulatory exam everyone has to take? You learn about these laws back in 1933 about how to protect investors and all the rest of it. There was a reason why they were there. We're in sort of uncharted territory now. And I think Gary Gensler was bringing up some interesting points. Now, I'm about to be, when people see this, people will criticize me heavily because most of my, associates, friends are all, crypto maniacs. But at the end of the day, the SEC has to do some of this, right? It has to be a thorn in the side. But it seems to be at the moment in the current environment, Gary Gensler is just another, he's got to go, and he's it just feels like it's got a bit extreme, or is that not the way to see it?
No, I'm not going to disagree with the point. I think what's interesting, tying this all the way back to Silicon Valley Bank's downfall and Twitter and
Yeah,
social media, the reality is this used to all happen with lobbyists behind closed doors, and now it
yeah,
happens on Twitter sphere X, threads, and so
yeah,
the reality is that that's where you're seeing kind of these trials of personality taking place, and so it's easy to just say, oh, they're getting in the way, they're causing problems, they're slowing things down, we're all about progress. And you're correct, there needs to be this healthy tension between those two. I think what
yeah,
you have is because 2021 was a period of to tie back to the bubble, irrational exuberance, right? And you're really looking at what happened in that post-COVID world that existed. That had so much deployment of capital. We have such a backlog of capital stuck within these companies that haven't been able to exit, while their acquirers have the largest free cash flows in history to be able to actually do these acquisitions. If you're a VC, you're looking at saying, I have these portfolio companies. I have to get them out because I have to get the cash back to my investors. And then you're seeing that there's these perfect acquirers who are sitting on so much cash they don't know what to do with, and
yeah.
they need that technology. So you just naturally expect these two to come together in a perfect marriage. And then you've got, from a Silicon Valley perspective, the divorce attorney Lena Khan running through the middle, saying, "Well, wait a minute, I'm going to, hack away at this," and they
No,
just felt
that's
like
right. That's right.
it,
Yeah.
it got stretched. And look, you can
And
argue it both ways,
presumably,
but you
yeah,
went after their pocketbooks, and you've
yeah,
actually slowed down the cycle of innovation. I truly, truly believe that
yeah,
I believe this, and I know the Silicon Valley folks believe this, that Silicon Valley actually has been the engine. We can argue about the innovation of the last 10 years, but it's been the engine that's helped drive the US economically since, call it the late 70s.
yeah.
And without that growth, um, frankly, we would not have the economic prosperity that's existed. And so they really believe that if you throw a cog in that wheel, you break that system down, you slow that system down, you're going to slow the United States down, and the US will fall behind. And so that's why you're getting that reaction. Clearly, there does always need to be checks and balances. What makes the system in the US work, whether it's politically, economically, is that there are checks and balances, right? Historically speaking. And if you get rid of those, then you definitely run risks the other way.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, if she deserves it or not, Lena's gone, Gary's gone. I mean, let's be clear. Every single person that was put in there, whether you're talking about it from the FCC, the EPA, the FDA, sorry, these are like the communications, the environment, the
They've all
drug
gone.
and food,
Yeah.
the,
They're all going to go.
they're
Yeah.
all gone, right? I mean, I think the
Yeah.
only person who will actually stay is Jerome Powell at the Fed, because the president can't actually replace them outside of their normalized term unless there's cause. And I
The
think
Fed
it's
is
safe
all
to say there's not.
powerful,
Yeah,
Yeah.
and so you kind of look at that's the only one that stays, and even then, Powell's term is up 18 months into Trump's 4 years, so there'll be two and
Yeah.
a half
So,
years with someone else.
so, so thinking going forward, so Trump means deregulation. It's kind of like, maybe when Ronald Reagan came into power in the 1980s, early 1980s, or 79, 80. And then maybe you could draw an analogy with Clinton and when he sort of deregulated finance. You've got this period now where you're going to see a lot of deregulation across the board. But in terms of certain growth areas, it's going to be, exciting times, maybe a free for all. We're going to see some crazy moves in equities. We're going to see some very interesting things happen. Could you just talk through how you think Trump's going to impact things, going forward? What could actually get the innovation cycle moving in the right direction now with Trump, looking at it in a more positive light?
Yeah, no, I mean, if you think about it from the perspective of what do you have to think through in regards to these economic prosperity in the country, you got to
Yeah.
think through inflation, you got to think through GDP growth, and you got to think through debt, right? And so you piece those together, and you can look at what the Trump policies are attempting to do in balancing these things, whether he's discussing tariffs and deportation that are going to increase inflation, which are going to cause issues in regards to GDP growth. But then you say, okay, I'm going to offset those with tax cuts and deregulation that are going to be pro-growth and help drive those things forward. And then, his favorite, tax cuts, right? Providing tax cuts, which is interesting at this time, given kind of where the debt levels are. But, again, this idea of spurring growth. So really, when he's looking at it, he's trying to say, how do I make it easier to get business done? And that's, ultimately, I mean, his Veep is a VC, right? I mean, like, by definition, you're going to have that kind of economic lens that exists there. And so I think in general, what this is going to do is create an acceleration in investment, because if you know that there's an opportunity for either deregulation that allows for faster growth, be it within the crypto, be it within an energy sector, be it, fintech, be it within healthcare, you're going to see money flow towards those things. And what you also see is money returned back out of them, because you'll start to see acquisitions, because when you know that the FTC becomes more of a rubber stamp versus, an impenetrable wall, then it starts to say, well, let's go do this. Let's go back to days when you had startups provided innovation and established companies provided distribution. And so again, you kind of found that marriage. And so I think when you see that, there's this excitement that if this capital gets returned, so if that $2.5 trillion gets returned to the limited partners, those LPs will put it back into new funds, and those new funds will really finance the next super cycle, which, and we haven't gotten into. But I think as you look at it, there's actually a really exciting time within Silicon Valley around AI, and I don't think most of the world actually understands just how impactful this is going to be. But if you free up that $2.5 trillion to bring it back in. Now, by the way, I don't think all $2.5 trillion gets released, because I do believe probably, $1 trillion of that is companies that are overvalued in regards to they run on old technologies. They got overvalued in that 2021 insanity. And so to say, are they going to find a good landing spot? Well, not at the valuations of what they've raised. So I don't think all $2.5 trillion gets returned, but I do think that a good portion of that, 60+% that gets returned in relatively short order. And so when you really piece that together, that's where you look at, say, that's that flywheel that then allows you to keep funding $300-400+ billion a year into the innovation ecosystem. And we are really at such an incredible inflection point of what's going to happen. I mean, what essentially the last couple of years, what's happened with transformers mirrors what happened with transistors back in the
So
1940s.
this is just for the audience. I mean, I think most people came across AI, they became familiar with it in 2023. It's recent, 2022, 2023. It was discussed. Everyone sort of knew it was happening, but it became a thing. Now, it kind of came at a good time, I think, because it sort of saved Silicon Valley, in some ways, I think, as an area to focus on. But can you sort of put it into some context in a couple of minutes, like how foundational this move is? How is it like the microprocessor in the 50s, 60s? Is it like the internet? What is it? What do you think it is right now? Where are we at?
Yeah, no, this is much bigger than the internet. The
Yeah.
internet is paltry compared to AI when you think about it from a global disruption perspective. So if we kind of break down into, I'll just call it 3 different periods of time, and this is again a gross oversimplification, but think about it as kind of, industrial revolution through mechanization time period taking place,
Hmm.
and that obviously lasted a couple hundred years. You can argue when it stopped, sometime in the 60s, 70s time frame, where you then had this creation of a digital age, and that digital age has carried us through till now. And again, I don't think it's stopped, but this is where the ages start to overlap each other. And
Yeah.
now we're really entering into, I don't know the right term for it, hasn't been coined yet, agentic age, generative age, AI age. Someone much better at branding will come up with a way to do that than I. But if you think about it, if you go back to what triggered the digital age, which has really had some of the greatest period of growth that we've seen, it is going back to essentially the transistor, what we had back at that point in time, that turned into the integrated chip, that then created the Intels of the world, that then allows you to have operating systems like a Microsoft, and hardware, whether you want to talk about the Apple devices or all the different PCs that came through with the HPs, the Dells, whatnot. Um, that then allows you to build out all the software capabilities. Then all the internet did is it just took the software and changed the delivery mechanism. So
Yeah.
instead of being delivered to you on floppy disks and then CDs, it's now just delivered to you over the internet. And so all that did is created a different access model. So that's why I consider all part of that same digital revolution timeframe. It was just a different delivery mechanism within it,
Yep.
which then you could add on how cloud built that out to further that delivery, mobile for the consumption of that content. And that kind of brings us to where you got to in over this past 15 years. You know, back in 2010, 11, you called it machine learning, right? Which, was just a fancy way of saying algorithms, right? But what you really had in 2017 was kind of this unlocking of transformers, and this is not from my childhood cartoons, but transformers in regards to what Google was doing research wise on AI, that really has created this agentic opportunity where now you can
Yeah.
get to
So
things around reasoning models. This isn't algorithms doing repetitive tasks. This is actually an ability for the machines to truly learn and reason. And
yeah.
that's where you look at it and say, okay, this is a new technology that's been developed. This is a fundamental breakthrough in physics that is going to create a whole new paradigm that is, this next digital age. We want to call it digital age 2.0, or you want to call it something else. And I think
Yeah.
that's where we're going to see this efficiency gains again that are astronomical to us. And where if you kind of go back and look at this digital age, you can imagine if you went back and said to people, I still remember when CTO was a was a new term, right, in the late 90s, early 2000s, and then chief data officers and these things. Guys, we're going to have a whole new roles and organizations that exist supporting what this agentic age is going to be. But
Yeah.
we
I
really are
think,
at that precipice
yeah,
of something incredible.
two things. I think 2017 seems to be crucial with that report from Google, right? Like a lot of people refer to it. I haven't spent much time looking at it, but it is something that people should be aware of because it set a foundation for what we have now. Is that fair? And then,
Yeah. Well, and,
y-
and, and here's ironic. Sorry to cut off, but here's the irony of it, right? So if you go back to the transistor,
yeah,
it was developed by Bell Labs, which is owned by AT&T, which was the largest monopoly at the time.
yeah,
And then you have the transformer, which was identified and broken by Google, who is deemed right now to be the largest monopoly in the United States at the
yeah.
time. So
Yeah.
it is
No, that's
back to your question about monopolies. There actually is some component of it that's driven most of the growth
which
within this
drives the
country.
innovation. But I suppose the counter argument to that is, Eisenhower, government agencies, they, all of those guys who are involved in the early stage of integrated circuits, etc., benefited from government support. And then
Oh yeah,
obviously with AI, it's been an 80-year story, 70-year story. There's been a lot of research. So I always find it interesting, we privatize the wins, we socialize the losses kind of thing. You know what I mean? Like I completely agree with you. Google was always going to come up with something here. They've got the brightest minds, etc. But it's an interesting question, which is not for today, but just the involvement of government in some of this, right? Do you see what I mean? And
yeah. No,
it seems
you're spot
profound
on
to
that.
me.
Yeah,
Yeah,
no, you're spot on. It goes back to I worked really hard for 20 years to become an overnight success, right?
correct.
So you are right. Like you can go back and chart that there's many things that go to it. But I guess I'm going to more like what was that catalyst event,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
There's a lot
yeah.
that
I
built
think,
up to that catalyst moment, but what built that catalyst, you're at that event, and now that event has occurred, and so
yeah,
now you're seeing that transition. I mean, if you even
yeah,
just look at some of the venture dollars invested, right, in the understanding of just how much this is, slowly, like that 2017, 22, I think you had about 25% of venture dollars, 30% of venture dollars going into AI companies.
yeah,
And obviously, since the Chat GPT moment where the world seemed to accept that AI was coming versus fearing that AI was coming, now you see like 70+% of net new
yeah,
dollars going
yeah,
into AI because the recognition here is you need to be early in these transformations because again, you look at the companies that are most valuable today, right? And their foundings. I think Google was the most recent one, 20 some odd years ago,
yeah,
and then you kind of go back whether it's the Apples and the Microsofts and whatnot. I guess even Amazon was the late 1990s, and so even we had the Fangs before that. So throw Netflix in there, right? Like they were still late 1990s. So there's really this understanding that as you're moving through this AI side of things, you need to be early on what it is because it's those early companies that figure out a business model that gives them the ability to produce the free cash flows to keep
yeah,
investing in the R&D and the acquisitions to keep building it, right? And so that's really where you put these things together and say, well, great, right now we're building the infrastructure. So go back to
yeah,
internet being built or whatnot. Like we're at that stage of what it is. 'Cause it's a different hardware technology, and so God bless NVIDIA. Here you go, right? The Intel of today type of thing. And then you look at it and say, well, now we need this foundational layer, which is these models. So thanks OpenAI and obviously tied to Microsoft. But then you've got these things, projects within all these large organizations, whether it's Meta with their open source one, Google with theirs, Bard/Gemini. So you can look at everyone's racing to build those layers. And then what you're going to end up with is the application layer. And what we actually found, if you kind of go back in time, if you look at the hardware chipsets to operating systems, foundation layers to kind of where most of the money actually was derived, it was in the application layer. And look, that's something that Bill Gates is famous for saying, like, you want the network that is built off of your system to be worth far more than your system. That means that you're an important component of that system, and that system's
yeah,
not going anywhere. And so that's what the race is right now: is how do you create essentially the new operating system, the new foundational models to be able to do this? Because in all the application we built off of that, and that's where most of the actual economic returns and efficiency gains will take place, especially early on. And so that's why you're seeing this race towards this. And the
to get it.
difference is, yeah, where what it took from, kind of 1970s through kind of called mid 2000s. So, you're talking 30 some odd years to get there. This is probably going to be truncated down to half of that. So
Yeah.
it's going to be,
So the
10,
question
15.
for you, Steve, is so you had Facebook or Meta, Facebook then. managed to transition from web to mobile, and most of the tech companies did, right? They were able to, in the early 2010s, do that quite well, whether it's through acquisition or not. Do you think they're going to be able to transition to this new age? Are they just going to buy all the startups that they can buy and just bring in the technology in house, or is there something fundamental that I think Mark Andreessen said you have to sometimes start afresh with certain areas of tech? Can you elaborate on that? Are we going to find a lot of new opportunities, and therefore this might actually be a great time to be investing in private tech companies? Does that make sense?
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. So I think the answer to your original question of will
Yeah.
they transition or will they acquire? The answer is yes, right?
Yeah.
So it'll be both, right? So the reality is some of the value that exists from some of these companies is the fact that they control key components of these systems that will allow it to work. So if you think about it from a Meta Facebook perspective, they've got this network effect that's giving them tremendous access directly to end consumers in a way that nobody else can, because it is literally a network, a social network. And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
that will provide them opportunities to figure out how to be beneficial to that network and thus monetize that network. And so as you
Yeah.
really look at that, that's why for them, probably their biggest fear is like a TikTok, right, type of
Yeah.
thing, as to who can compete with them on it. But that gives them an opportunity to go eat Google's lunch, right? Because Google is essentially providing a service without a network for people
Yeah.
around their search it business, right?
Yeah.
And so, while it may be controversial to say, Google's search business is not going to be what Google is known for in 10 years, right? Google's going to be known
Yeah.
for a whole
Yeah.
bunch of other things, and whether it's a broken up Google, and so you actually know these other companies separately from what Google is, or not broken up, it's not going to be a search company, because fundamentally, search is actually going to need to fall within these social networks where people already existing in having
Yeah.
these conversations and engagements. Or you have on the other side, which is really focused on the combination of what a Microsoft and an Apple have been able to accomplish. Apple actually owns the hardware and its operating system. Microsoft just owns the operating system existent on other people's hardware. But ultimately, that allows them to also provide these agentic opportunities, because it's going to be embedded within their operating systems. And so
Yeah.
if you think about it, that puts those three really at an advantage to the rest of the market, because they're controlling kind of key access points to these AI networks. Now, are they going to be able to develop all the tools, applications, capabilities for that? No. I mean, the most powerful thing about Apple is its App Store, right? It's
Yeah.
not that it said, I'm going to develop every app. It's no, the world is going to be really good at this. We just want to be the platform that it's built on, that we can help drive that. And so that's really where you're going to see that continuation of that. How do I hold on to that hardware advantage, right? Their biggest risk is that someone comes up with a new form factor, called the Meta glasses, right? That usurps them, that the phone is no longer your access point. And if the phone is no longer your access point, then Apple loses that network component. So I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
there's going to be a lot of acquisitions that happen in that hardware space, because when we saw what happened with the Apple Pro, like I think it's the shortest lived Apple product in history, right? And so you kind of look at and understand where these evolutions are going. There's going to be those opportunities within just what would disrupt those big folks, or what would actually be complementary to them continuing to maintain their position. And that's before we even get to any form of application layer, which is actual usefulness built on top of what they already have.
Yeah. Yeah. Fair enough. That's that. I. So my view is, if you're thinking from an investment point of view, you're probably okay owning some of the large cap compounders still, the tech names, because they will be able to acquire interesting assets and improve their product. But, just from an investment point of view, trying to navigate this space, it's quite tricky, right? Like AI, right? There's a lot to it, and there's a lot of things that are just applications that don't have any foundational layer, and so what I found going through the private, I've got one. I'm very much involved in one, which I think is a foundational layer, and it's the tech has been built over years. It's not just been built, the last since 2021 or 2022. It's taken a long time to run the models, but it's a tricky space, right? So, this brings us to, what you do, and what you look at, because I think it would be interesting to hear, now that you no longer live in Silicon Valley, you're in Australia, what you're hoping to do with your focus now, your business, and maybe you could speak a little bit about that, if that's okay, and how that might tie in with looking for opportunities in AI.
Yeah, no. So I did move from San Francisco to Brisbane, Australia last year. Married to a Brizzy girl, so at post COVID made sense to come this way and be closer to her family. But yeah, in doing so, I've really begun to look at the Australian innovation ecosystem really with a lens towards understanding what's here, what opportunities exist, specifically those that I'd be able to bring to the US. What I actually have to say is there still is, while there's definitely an eye towards global, the exposure and experience to the global innovation ecosystem isn't really that strong yet in the Aussie ecosystem. We have to remember the Aussie ecosystem is still relatively new. I mean, you're talking about an ecosystem, and if you want to tie it back to an Atlassian as kind of the Cisco, right, for drawing parallels, it's really only a 11 year old ecosystem. Now it's had
Atlassian
tremendous
is the
growth.
Cisco. That's a good
Yes,
one. Yeah, I'm going to
yeah.
use that.
What
Yeah.
what I think Canva's the PayPal, right? Like it's
Oh,
I
there you
think,
go.
and that's what you needed. You need these big exits that release a bunch of capital and release a bunch of talent, right? Because those
Yeah.
companies have been hoarders of talent, and as you have these exits take place, that will go out and that becomes the proliferation. I mean, if you actually build, I mean, everyone talks about the PayPal mafia, but you actually that's we built out the neural map that actually mapped all the connections that happened, and you could look back, and it was actually about 60% of the successful outcomes tied back to somebody who was part of those organizations early on. And
That's
so
right. Yeah. Yeah.
inherently you'll start to see that same thing happen here. So I'm excited because I feel like, not to be derogatory to the Aussie ecosystem, but it feels like it's the late 90s here, right? There's some excitement, there's some buzz, there's opportunity, there's familiarity. People are interested in joining it. They're coming off, kind of a risk curve of like understanding of saying, yeah, okay, I can understand this disruption. I can understand it's higher risk, higher reward. Yeah, let's go try it. And really, you need the talent, right? That talent and capital, the two things you need, and those two have to grow side by side as they go. And right now, I think Australia is probably over indexed on talent and under indexed on capital. I think some that just has to deal with the source of capital right now are more family offices and high net worth individuals. It's not as much institutional capital, whereas I think you tie that parallel to the U.S. The big unlock in the U.S. was institutional capital. Whether it's starting with the endowments and pension funds, and then slowly rolled its way into a broader universe. And here
Yeah.
you look at it, you don't quite have that. You don't have that same endowment system that we have in the U.S. But then from a pension perspective, you've got, I think was it the third largest pool of assets in your pension system, and so
Yeah.
it could be an incredible unlock. But as far as I understand, there's some regulatory components that maybe hold that back, and maybe there just hasn't been an understanding, similar way that insurance was late to the party in venture capital in the States. Maybe there's more of that you know uh, viewpoint of a little risk off side of things. And I think if you look at Australia, where it could go over the next 10-15 years, during what I think is frankly going to put the digital age to shame in this AI age, um, Australia is really uniquely positioned to has really good research. It's got really good entrepreneurs. It's built up a very strong education system around it. Its funding system is a little immature. I mean, obviously, venture capital is an apprenticeship model, and if your kind of biggest, best firms have only been around for 10, 12 years instead of 30, 40 years, right? There's
Yeah.
just a different kind of the proliferation of that ecosystem. But you've got that raw talent that's been learning it over this past 10 years. But really what needs to happen is that unlock of the capital, which probably has to come from that pension or supers ecosystem that exists here. If that gets unlocked, I think Australia actually can become this innovation island that can really drive it forward because it's got all the necessary ingredients to be able to do that. But it's going to take that. It's going to take a little more of a risk on.
What about like a city like Brisbane? You know, if you could get, you know, a large US company to move here, you know. So I, through my travels in life, I lived in Raleigh, North Carolina for a bit, and in that area, Apple set up a headquarters, and presumably it's had a massive impact. I mean, when these companies turn up to a city, the impact is quite large because all of a sudden, late 20-year-olds are earning proper money, you know, not, you know, pretty good money, and they've got a career and they're very excited. And it, from that, creates an ecosystem, right?
Yeah, so
Does Australia need something like that, more of that?
uh, so I think a derivative of that, right? So you got to think about it. Why did they go to Raleigh? Well, because that's a research triangle, and you have three incredible
Correct. Yeah.
academic institutions. So there is a
Yeah.
component of research that ties to it. There's no surprise that what's happened in innovation is tied to what exists from a research breakthrough perspective. So Silicon Valley is tied to Stanford, right? And a lot of what Stanford was able to produce early on in that ecosystem of
Correct.
it.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
why you see some of the healthcare is out of Boston, given some of the universities up there in that Northeast corridor and what they were doing. You end up with fintech in New York, obviously, because all the banking systems, similar to London, all the banking systems, right? So those are the two fintech hubs. So you start to see that, and so you know what you're talking about for the Raleigh Durham area of things really is that research triangle driving through a lot of research that help to feed the innovation. So you end up with these kind of Bell Labs types of
Yeah.
opportunities.
Yeah.
So if I were to draw that to Australia, you've got really strong academic institutions. Those academic institutions aren't necessarily the most commercially minded in regards to spinning out technologies. Now, granted, it wasn't that way in the States either until, you know, Stanford and MIT looked at this and said, there's a better way to do this and spin out. And what they realize is if you make it easier to spin these technologies out to get them funded, they had 10x the ideas coming out, right? So
And was
just by
Google was the big one for them, right? In terms of
Google was
university
one of
wins.
them. Yeah.
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 Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's where you kind of look at it as a shots on goal from a university perspective, making it easier. But I think if you try to look specifically, you brought up Brisbane, right? So Brisbane, if you look at it and you try to say, okay, what do you want to do? You either have to compete with an existing kind of powerhouse. So like, oh, if you're going to do fintech, are you positioned to go take on London, New York? Probably not. That's probably a Sydney thing if there's going to be any battles to take place there. You can look at it and say, well, maybe from a clean tech perspective, there's opportunities. Maybe from an ag
Yeah.
tech perspective, there's opportunities. And those, I think, could be tremendous components of it. I think then you can look at and say, well, what do you already have here? Well, you've got, a Gilmore, so you've got space, and you could look at it. So well, Australia is actually really uniquely positioned from a space perspective. They're never going to be a SpaceX. Let's be clear, but Australia has different rules around what they can launch. Also have different
Yeah.
orbital paths, so that creates a unique opportunity. You've got defense. A lot of, like Vutran's doing some of that. You can look at it and say that's interesting, but again, is Australia going to be, number one on defense? Probably not. And as you kind of look at, so these all seem to me like they're complementary things, but where hubs of those things tend to exist elsewhere. If I had to say I'm going to make a bet on what puts Brisbane on the maps, it ain't the Olympics. It's quantum computing because you happen to
Right.
have from a
I thought it
fundamental
was this podcast. No.
that's a close number two.
Yeah. Thanks. Thanks.
Although
Appreciate it.
who knows, you may end up moving to back to the UK or the States at
You
some
never
point.
know. You never
There
know,
you
dude.
go. We need something that stays. But I think you look at it and say back to the idea of, as we were just discussing, these fundamental physics breakthroughs.
Yeah.
Quantum computing could be another one of those fundamental physics breakthroughs. And so if you look at that and you say, wow, actually, three of the top 7, 8, 10 researchers in the world are in Brisbane. I mean, it's kind of a little bit of, pardon the language, blind ass luck that you happen to
Yeah.
have like
Yeah.
three of the best. You happen to have one who was great, who then brought two people with them, and and that came from the UK. So right, it's
Wow.
actually
Yeah. I didn't even
created
know
this
that. Yeah.
this
Yeah.
opportunity that you could look at it, and look, it's high risk, but if it pulls it off, and Brisbane can become actually the hub of quantum computing, and you can imagine what that builds out around it. That's really, I think, when you look at it, that's where you could truly stand out as a differentiator on a
Yeah.
global scale, not ever playing second fiddle to any other global location by being able to do that. Everything else, I feel like they could become a powerhouse, but they may not become the powerhouse. And I think what you're always looking for is, how do you become the powerhouse, right? How did each of these different areas, like we said, medical in Boston, fintech in London, as you go with cyber in Israel, right? Like you've seen these different areas where, because of those research centers, that proliferation's taken place because of the organizations that exist.
That's right. That's
That's
right.
actually where I could see this drive, and that I think would be,
No,
way
that's
more
a very
exciting
interesting
than
point.
that last
I just
thing in
feel
Tampa.
this is somewhat controversial, but I just feel like you get all these very intelligent kids out of the universities, and it's the same in the UK, no doubt. Um, and they're solving problems that are kind of not that interesting, like organizing software for receipts or ordering your coffee or whatever it is. And they're engineer graduates who should be doing harder stuff, or they should go and get a proper job for 20 years. I know that
Well,
sounds like
well,
because there's life is long. They could be an entrepreneur when they're 40, right? So, it just seems at the moment, I think it's a little bit unfair sometimes what people say to the young kids, like, go and take loads of risk and you're going to be focused on this silly piece of software which maybe works, maybe doesn't.
y-
And I
y-
do think there should be a bit more structure. If it's quantum computing and you can find some really top grads, you will create an ecosystem around that. Does that make sense? I think
so I,
this.
I I agree with the last part of your statement, right,
Yeah.
around quantum and what you could do there.
Well, it
Um,
was your
I'm
point.
not, yeah, I'm not sure I agree with the first part of your statement,
Yeah.
because the reality is the energy that you need to have to be successful in the startup universe is actually probably better akin to someone in their 20s and 30s than to someone
Yeah.
in their 40s and 50s. And yes, you're balancing wisdom versus energy, but I would bet on energy all day long, because you can outsource wisdom by getting the right advisors, the right mentors, the right guides. I'm not talking about like formal advisory boards. I'm talking about the people who are actually in there helping, right? I spend a lot of time helping young entrepreneurs think through, hey, I've seen this problem before, blank, 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 right? You can outsource that wisdom. It's kind of, Sheryl Sandberg to Mark Zuckerberg, right? You can outsource the wisdom, but that energy, that drive, that ridiculousness of, I'm going to do, 100 hours a week. I'm doing 16 hours a day, 7 days a week. Like, go, go, go. I'm almost too naive to know what's coming ahead of me that would have caused me to stop. And so I'm just going to blow right through that brick wall, right? And then that next one, that next one. So I actually believe that there's a great opportunity around these. Now, are they all picking the right things to go through? Look, at the end of the day, you want to solve hard problems because hard problems are most rewarding. So I agree with you. An app for organizing your receipt or ordering your coffee really is, that's all going to be AI anyways. So it's only going to really leave hard problems as we go forward. But as I think about it, really, if I had to peel back to the kind of first principles, it's because of a lack of capital. I think one of the things that exists
Yeah.
here in Australia is there's a real viewpoint towards, I'm going to do a bunch of research to get really good product, because when I bring that product to market, it's got to kick ass and do tremendous revenues really, really fast. And in the States, someone says, I'm going to get a product to market really fast, and because I know it's going to fail and I got to get to version 3 before it's going to be even useful. and no one's really going to care about my early revenues as to what it is, because I'm just figuring out the product market fit and where it goes and how it goes. And I think it's because that abundance of capital exists in the US that allows for that to take place. So if you just look at like average round size, I mean, seed rounds in the States are, 5 to 7 million bucks, and here they're all sub $2 million, right?
Yeah.
And part of that is, and that's not even taking into account exchange rates. Part of that is just there's 222 times the amount of early stage capital in the US as there's in Australia. There's not 222 times the amount of people. It's not 222 times the amount of ideas. There's just that amount of capital. So it allows for people to work on harder projects, to go bigger, to do that because they're not worried about that access.
And that
to
all
capital.
is private money, is it? Or is some of that?
Yeah. The government really, the government is a great customer, but they are not really involved from a
That's interesting.
financing
Yeah.
perspective in the
Yeah.
US. So yeah, I think that often can be a problem here. I mean, I think the government needs to be a catalyst and help. I think the number one catalyst they could do would be to unlock the supers. If they unlock the
Yeah.
supers, then they don't really have to be involved. If they don't unlock the supers, then they are the largest pool of capital available, and so inherently they'd have to be more involved here. And so I think, look, I think the government is more beneficially involved in Australia. I think it hasn't been as beneficially involved in the U.S. outside of being a customer. But I think as we look through kind of what is on the horizon here, I think that combination that you have here, if you could unlock those supers, really creates a dynamic environment and ecosystem that could help drive Australia to run fast. But I guess going back to just where we were at, I actually am a big believer in betting on those early folks. I'm also a data dork, so I know that it's actually usually your third startup that is successful. So if you think about it, you get someone in their mid to late 20s, and they spend 4 to 8 years on company one, 4 to 8 years on company two, 4 to 8 years on company three. Let's draw an average in that. Say it's 18 years. Guess what? They're in their early 40s by the time they've had that exit, but they've been able to have that energy to help drive that forward and do that. So
It's
you
a
don't want to
journey.
pick someone up in their 40s and have them write it out for 20 years.
No. I see. Youth is important. Youth and enthusiasm. That's
Yeah.
kind of
And
something it's very powerful. So, just how will people get in touch with you if they'd like to speak to you about? Because you're obviously running your own. You're very involved in the early stage tech area. Is there some
So,
way
so
to get in touch with
we're
you?
doing so we're basically doing pre-seed through Series A investments with an eye towards taking companies to the States, leveraging the network of customers, partners, and funding sources in the U.S. really to
Yeah.
help grow from that perspective. I mean, LinkedIn, happy to connect. Email address is just steve@thirdhorizon.vc. Happy to chat from that perspective. I'm always looking for interesting companies that are out there, interesting founders that have great ideas. And if anyone's really just needing help understanding, navigating the U.S. ecosystem, it's complex. It's tough to necessarily understand from research. Maybe give it a couple of years, and ChatGPT can give you a full breakdown of it. But right now, it's still fairly relationship driven. So happy to help kind of anybody here in A and Z navigate their way over there.
And of course, Steve, if any family offices or people have made investments in a variety of things and are just thinking through their investments, you'd be happy to chat with anyone, right? About these things.
Yeah. I mean, the way I look at it, I'm trying to help move this ecosystem forward into the potential that I see, and I think, frankly, that's done in a pay it forward mentality. I think that's part of what makes Silicon Valley so great, is that co-opetition. You compete, but at the same time you collaborate. I honestly, I think there's much more of a zero sum mentality here versus there's an exponential mentality, and so I really want to make sure that we help develop this ecosystem and what's proven to work, and that pay it forward. How do you help someone out before you need help type of thing? And so glad to do that with anybody that's interested in the ecosystem.
That's great. So, Steve, thank you so much for today. I really appreciate your time. We've had a good chat. We've covered a lot of topics, and look forward to seeing you for a beer soon.
Sounds good. Likewise. Take care, Martine.
Okay. Thank you.
All
Bye
right.
bye.
Bye now.